This is the Lean Construction Blogs Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories, case studies, and lessons learned of applying lean construction from around the world. Join Dick Beyer as he interviews industry leaders, lean construction practitioners, and subject matter experts to help you improve the build environment in general and your design and construction projects in particular, advance your lean journey, and bring your continuous improvement efforts to the next level. Let's get started.
Welcome, everybody, to the podcast. I'm Dick Beyer, and you're not, at least likely. We've got a great episode this session with truly one of the great pioneers of what we have been striving for in our community. It's hard to describe him as merely a lean guy because he's right there in the pioneers of bringing all kinds of learning to our community, and he's been doing it for a very long time. So let me introduce my friend Mike Casten. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning. Good morning.
How are you?
I am better than I deserve.
Yeah, I always say I'm pretty good for an old guy.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I'm looking at it. So let's just jump right into your story. You and I reconnected. We had been on a program in Hawaii, you reminded me of, but we reconnected at Greg Howell's remembrance session in Menlo Park. And there were so many great stories there, and you had so many to tell that I was really anxious to get you on the podcast to share that with the people who've been following the stories that we're trying to retell in this space. So thank you for joining us, number one. And let's start with, let's start with some background. Where were you born? How'd you get into construction? Did you get thrown off a train by your folks and you had to be a hobo with George Clooney out there singing gospels, or what's your story?
I had the good fortune of growing up in northern Colorado before everybody moved there. I was third generation Colorado, and
what city up there?
The town of Windsor, Colorado. And in those days, Windsor was a very small community, farming community, and now it's one of the fastest growing cities. Now it's not just a community; it's a thriving, growing town, and
it's kind of like North Denver now, right? I mean, that whole stretch
correct,
up to almost to Cheyenne. Yeah, well,
correct.
I'm a Denver boy myself. I grew up in Denver, as I may have told you. So, not only you, but Gary Fisher, that I had on the podcast a couple of sessions ago, who is the director of the Project Productivity Institute. He was raised over in Grand Junction and was born in Colorado. So there's a great Colorado connection between big thinkers and the state. So welcome, fellow Coloradan. All right, so you were born and raised in Windsor.
So I grew up on a farm and learned what it took to make a farm work. I wasn't the guy running it, obviously, my dad was, but I learned to appreciate what it took to get work done then. And farmers have to be very self-reliant. So we learned welding, we learned all kinds of mechanics and those kinds of things. And so that really was and you're outdoors all the time. My mother happened to be a graduate of the University of Colorado and was the head of the business department in the school where I went to school. And so I also got introduced to the business side of things with my mom. She was a very, very well-respected teacher, and it was not fun to take courses from her, but I learned a whole lot. Then I started in school at Colorado State and majored in business and really found nothing exciting in that, and dropped out of school and went out to California and got into the carpenter's apprenticeship program and turned out as a card-carrying carpenter. And it was while I was there in California and working on construction projects that I discovered my passion. And they say if you first have to discover your passion and then you'll discover your purpose. And I discovered my passion, and I decided I wanted to go back to school. So I went back to Colorado State, which was at that time there were about 25 schools of construction that were modeled after the Stanford Master's Program in Construction Management. And while there, had the amazing opportunity to interview with and be hired by the Hensel Phelps construction company when they were a very small company. I mean, relative to today.
Right.
And
it was actually known as Colorado Agriculture and Mining back in those days, right?
Right, yeah.
Colorado, and long before they had the Rams, they were the Aggies.
Yeah. I'm not that old. We were the Rams when I went there.
Oh, okay.
But when I finished a summer internship with Phelps, I got invited to their annual meeting up in Estes Park, up near Rocky Mountain National Park. And at that meeting was a guy by the name of Henry Parker, who was a professor at Stanford, and he gave a short talk on a demonstration of time-lapse photography and how to use time-lapse photography to analyze construction operations. I wanted to make something clear along that line. A lot of people now, when I talk about time-lapse, they think they have to have cameras that do time-lapse. The only reason we used time-lapse in those days was because we were using video film, and a 50-foot roll of 8mm tape would allow you to shoot 4 hours worth of construction if the clock was set on 4 seconds per frame. So we use time-lapse not to capture time-lapse like a lot of people think you do, but simply because there was no way to capture 4 hours worth of work in a video camera like you can today. So, but at any rate, we began to learn very quickly that there was huge opportunity in the work that we were doing. And that really, for me, was probably the single most, the single biggest impact on my career early on, because I was given the opportunity to go out into the field because of my carpenter background. And I felt very comfortable on projects, and we began to learn very quickly that there was huge opportunity that was not showing up in cost reports. And it was then that I began to realize there is a huge difference between output measures, that is the typical cost report that's nothing but a sum of hours spent and production produced, and process metrics that begin to define how work moves through space and time. And it is one of those things that still frustrates me, because I wouldn't say it's a lost art, because it never really got into the construction vernacular and habits, because it takes time, it takes some learning and so on. But boy, we learned some things there that were just incredible. And about that, well, shortly after we begin to get involved with that, and I wanted to talk about the impact Stanford had. Hank Parker Parker and a guy named Oglesby published a book called Construction Methods. And that book brought out 3 things that were really new, I think, to the construction conversation. One was sort of the import of industrial engineering analysis of construction operations. A second was the need for really paying attention to quality and safety. And the third was motivators and demotivators, or the human factors. Clark Oglesby was a real advocate of both safety and understanding what motivates craftsmen and what demotivates them. So with that, after not too long a period of time, the further I got up in the organization, the more I realized I was getting further and further away from the work.
Right.
And the work was where my passion was. And I began to realize that my purpose was really to help people see the work differently. So I started consulting in 1978, and had the very good fortune of needing a time-lapse camera, and the guy at the time that was selling them or running the company was Greg Howell, and he and I instantly became very good friends and worked together on a lot. So at that time, the focus was fundamentally on work methods at the crew level. And that was only because that's all we knew, because that's where Hank Parker started. And that's
Right.
what he taught. The irony is, of course, that over time we began to learn that work methods were probably trumped by the need for predictable and reliable flow. And again, one of the frustrations I've had over the years is, as predictable and reliable flow trumped work methods, I will use make a metaphor of imagine a mile relay team where there's 4 guys that run a 440 leg. And if all we do is practice the handoff of the baton, we're never going to drop the baton, so that the flow between one leg to another will always be good. But you may well have 4 guys that can't run a 2-minute 440.
Right.
And so we're very predictable and very reliable, but our race ends about 3 minutes after a team made up of guys that run 45, 50-second 440s. So
yeah, what's funny about that is Greg had a story about how he came upon the parade of trade simulation that we use. And his story was that he was working with Henry Parker and doing the time-lapse photography, and he would observe that the drywall crew was wasting a lot of time moving around. They had, they hadn't loaded their stuff up. They had to go fetch things. They were all over the place. So he went down there and he helped them. And by helping them, all of a sudden he created that backlog that's represented in the parade of trades by that pile of chips that's sitting in front of the drywall guy.
Right.
And when he pushed that through, he just pushed the bottleneck to the next guy. And so that was where he really began the understanding of not only, Eli Goldrath and the goal and those kinds of things, but how important these connections were. So it's important to do the work in a fashion that's efficient, but it's also important to pass it on in a way that the next guy can receive it. And that the heart of the last planner is that conversation that happens to help control that. So I'm really, it's interesting that you started on time-lapse photography as well, because it is a different way of seeing the work. And I think that's, what you said, that you've been really interested in how to see the work.
At the time, the Machine That Changed the World hadn't been published. Right. Japanese imports were considered something significantly less important than General Motors cars. And so our focus was simply on how to improve work methods. And we both started there. The interesting thing was that, I'll share an example with you. The first job we did together was on a section of elevated freeway in Honolulu. And there was an operation there where they were forming and pouring pier caps. And these were big pier caps. These were about 180 yard pier cap, 180 cubic yards of concrete per pier cap. And when we got there, they'd done about 10 of them, and they were averaging 54 man days per pier cap. 2 weeks later, after working with the crews and filming the work and understanding how the time was spent, the next pier cap they did was in 17 man days.
Wow.
And that number keeps coming up over and over. As Greg used to say, it's almost like pie. Every time you get into the details of the work, you find that there's a 3 to 4 times the opportunity. At a company called American Infrastructure, one of the things I began to realize was that it's very easy to talk about what the potential of an operation is by analyzing it. But if people haven't experienced that potential, they assume you're in serious need of a drug test.
And this was even back before drugs were a problem, right?
Right. And so we developed a concept called a potential zone. And the idea was we would analyze an ongoing operation, knowing that we had a similar operation coming up, and produce what we called, and this is big vernacular here, big language, an engineered potential production solution, as opposed to just an operation plan. And then we would deploy that into an upcoming operation. And we did 125 of those with a company. At that time, it was called American Infrastructure. Now it's the Alan Myers Company. And at the end of that, we tallied up what was the difference between what had been the estimated production and what they achieved in as they had carried out this detailed plan. And the difference, remarkably, was 4.29 to 1 on average.
Wow.
The downside was that in none of those projects, as the jobs wrapped up, was the savings, and in some cases, this was substantial savings, showed up at the bottom line. That is, we creatively figured out how to sort of pee away the money we'd made on improving one operation. And it was then that the guy that owned that company, a guy by the name of Ross Myers, said I had given Ross a copy of the book, The Toyota Way, which had just recently come out. And he took it on a skiing trip out to Montana. And when he came back, he said, we have to develop our own production system. Now, at that time, Greg and Glenn were writing papers at about the rate Lennon and McCartney were writing songs. And so we had the advantage of having the Toyota Way book and white papers coming out every 6 weeks or so. And we began to develop what was called what they call the AI production system. So the interesting thing was that the learning that came from knowing how incredibly easy it was to significantly improve operations led us to begin to understand. I mean, Greg and Glenn were writing at the time about the need for predictable and reliable flow. And they had found that the average project experienced about 55 to 60% planned complete. That is, they, on an average weekly work plan, 50 to 60% of those things got done as planned when planned.
Yeah,
and
it was funny that the actual number that they came up with was 54%.
Right.
So when we gave them the Pioneers Award, we gave them baseball jerseys of their favorite team with the number 54 on the back. Just to remind us of how poorly we were doing. And it wasn't because people only wanted to do half of what they thought they were going to do every week, right? I mean, that's key. I always love that number because I always think about, well, what if you just had half the sleep you needed every night? What if you just had half the food you needed? What if you only had a half a conversation? I mean, that's basically what we're talking about.
You know, and another interesting thing was in conversations with Glenn, he has pointed out time and time again that most of those operations were making budget at 54%. Right. That is, 50, when they're only doing 54% of what they planned to do, they were still making budget. And then the book Factory Physics came out, where they introduced the laws of variability, and those guys said that variability will cause a process or system to become buffered with excess capacity, excess time, and excess cost. As that 4.29 number began to surface, it suddenly dawned on me that what we had done with the potential zones is we had eliminated variability. And we ensured that they were almost in a cocoon kind of setting, that is, those operations. So we weren't talking about variability then. We were just talking about making things happen the way we wanted them to happen and to do it without interruption or disruption. But we eliminated variability. And when we got variability out of the system, all of those operations, now these are not detailed, these were things like setting precast or forming walls or placing concrete or placing asphalt pavement or putting in underground storm drain systems. So this was really 1 grunt food, 2 grunt water, simple kinds of construction operations. And we found a delta of 4.29 to 1. And as I begin to think about that, it caused me to realize that is what we call excess capacity or excess time or excess cost that is being created in the system as a buffer to the 54% planned complete.
So anyway, you were talking about realizing that 4.29 was our excess capacity, our excess buffer, the cost of that were added to budget because that's how budgets were made.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you think about it, budgets are nothing but an accumulation of historical cost. And if you've done nothing to get the variability out of the work in the past, you've got the variability built into the cost that you're using going forward. You know, Deming used to say using output measures is like taping your windshield over with today's newspaper and then trying to figure out where you're going by looking in your mirror.
Right. Yeah, I mean this is exactly the point that we make about oversight rather than proactive management, right? You're looking back at stuff, and the things that you're going to look back at include the entire history of that stuff, not just the good stuff.
That's right. That's right. You know, in his book, Managerial Breakthrough, Joseph Duran, who was one of those guys, one of the 2 Americans that went to Japan to help bail them out and get them turned around. He discovered, even in that setting in Japan, where their very livelihoods was dependent on their ability to get significantly better with higher quality, that the traditional management approach of organize, plan, direct, staff, and control became a self-fulfilling philosophy, and he could get no energy into that system, and consequently came up with the term breakthrough, which is fundamentally what we were doing with time-lapse film to get into the operations and figure out how to change them. And the sad thing is, Dick, that my experience is we are still fundamentally, as an industry, relying on that plan, do, organize, direct, control kind of mentality. And it is a rare company that has begun to get into the process metrics and the relationship between the work itself and the work zone in which crews do the work to even understand what their opportunities are, because they're all buried in those costs. All of those operations that exceeded budget by 4.29 in terms of production would have made budget at 1.
Right. Yeah. What's funny is that we're really talking about legacy and how legacy kills us, because these companies were founded. They've been cruising along. They've been doing just fine. They've been happy with P6, and they've been happy with their crazy estimation software that they never update and they never calibrate. And they're just fine. They're making money hand over fist, as one of them told me. And what I think Thomas Kuhn pointed out was that until the system is stressed, there's no reason to change a paradigm, right?
That's right.
And this is a terrible system, but the system works for the people that operate it. It just doesn't work for the patient. It's the owners now that are going, why are 100% of my projects over budget? And I say, they're not just over budget, they're over the negotiated budget, which has nothing to do with the actual cost of the work. It was a contractual negotiation, both in time and budget, that they were trying to get it as high as possible and you're trying to get it as low as possible. And it's completely unrelated to how long it takes to actually build a project or how much it costs.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Well, the transitions for me and for Greg and Glenn and a bunch of us was we went from focusing on operations, that is individual operations. Then, as a result of an invitation from John Borcherding at the University of Texas, who was a professor there and I think still is, who was a Stanford graduate and who had studied under Clark Oglesby specifically, John was beginning to try to understand what the motivating and demotivating factors were and what craftsmen's perceptions were relative to their work. And he had put together a questionnaire, a craftsman questionnaire survey with a deal with a Department of Energy grant. And he and I'm having a senior moment here.
We love those senior moments.
A cohort of his at the University of Texas, who later helped found the CII, they decided to put on a construction productivity improvement in the construction industry workshop at the University of Texas. And Greg and I got invited to be there as speakers. And sitting in the room were some folks from Monsanto and Conoco that had a olefins unit that they were building with Brown and Root as the contractor. And after that, they invited us to meet with them, and they said, we want you guys to develop a project productivity improvement program. So then our thinking went from individual operations to thinking about how do we help a project that at that time was in serious trouble. And we came up with a five-point plan that included doing methods analysis, doing form and delay surveys and questionnaires to get craftsmen's input, doing foreman training, and doing a motivation kind of program. And that thing turned that job around in about 6 months. And trust me, none of us knew what we were doing. Greg thought he did, but none of us knew what we were doing, and none of us realized that we were onto something that hadn't really been developed prior to that. And ironically, on that project, we needed a local facilitator to be there when we weren't, and we chose a young piping engineer by the name of Glenn Ballard. And needless to say, Glenn took to that very well, understood what was going on. But the thing that happened as a result of that was that now, instead of just focusing on individual work operations and their metrics, we began to talk about productivity improvement programs. And that program made the cover of Engineering News Record, and I haven't done any marketing since. It was unbelievable. And we got involved in a project in Venezuela. And on that project, we had the opportunity to get Hank Parker involved with us down there. And it was a very large project. And we deployed those things we had learned and this was a project that had about 10,000 craftsmen. And it was being self-performed by the contractor. And that job turned around in very, very quickly. And that led me to begin to think about the fact that, one of the frustrations was in the middle of that job, the project manager was changed out and a new one came on board, and he brought with him the habits that he had developed somewhere else. And I began to realize that on large projects, with very large companies, the odds of being able to have a lasting impact were relatively small because of the number of people, because of the geology, the footprint. When you're working all over the world and you've got 80,000-90,000 people, so I begin to think I want to be very selective in picking clients that are interested in doing sort of what we did at American Infrastructure, and that is work on customizing a production system within their company. And my thought was, if we can get companies like that really being, running on all 8 cylinders and doing well, they will begin to change the market simply by the way they compete in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I remember Greg talking about that Venezuelan project, and he said that you guys were there and you had to make some confidential observations to the board. And one of the observations was, well, there's 10,000 guys wandering around and they don't seem to have anything to do. They're not even carrying like a 2x4. And the next day, this confidential communication to the board ended up with 10,000 guys wandering around, all carrying 2x4s. So not only were they not doing anything, they were messing with the inventory system.
Well, there's another great side story to that. The owner, the guy whose name the company was we had taken a bunch of pictures and went back to show them what was happening on the project, and he came down about 2 weeks later. And this was back in the days when all of those petrochemical projects were first built in model. They would make models. Often the models would cost $2 or $3 million to build because they were so complex.
Right.
And I was sitting in the back of the corner of this project manager's office. And so when this owner, the construction company owner, walked in, he didn't know that I was sitting there. And he said to him, I've just got one concern. I just finished walking the project. And, you know, when we got the owner to agree to build the model, we told him it would look exactly like the project and the project would look exactly like it does. And he shook his head and said, yes. And he said, well, we've got a real problem. And this guy just turned sort of ashen. And he said, is there a unit out of place, or are there piping that's wrong, or what? And he said, no. He said, I was just in the model room and then I walked the project. And so here's what I want you to do. I want you to either take 50 gallons of trash and dump it all over the model, or clean up the project. Now, you let me know. I'll be in my office on Monday.
Oh my God, that is such a great story, because the first indicia of a good project is that it's clean.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
every terrible project has trash everywhere.
That's right.
I mean, it's like 4.29. It is like pi. It is just every project that has trash everywhere sucks.
That's right. And if, you know, one of the papers that recently I've been amazed by the impact it has, and I need to get in touch with Laurie Cascella and let him know. But Laurie, I'm guessing you're familiar with Laurie Cascella.
Oh, I've had dinner with him and his family, and tried to, you know, he's not a guy that shoots the breeze easily.
That's right. That's
but
right.
He is really, I mean, he's the guy that reminded us about Trueheart. I mean, he's a very thoughtful guy.
He is the guy who first started sort of sending memos around saying this, hey, I think we ought to pay attention to this Toyota production system and how we could apply it to construction. I mean, he was the guy that began to rub everybody's noses in what was happening at Toyota and said, we need to figure out how to adapt this. But anyway, Laurie wrote a paper called Making Do. And the theme of the paper is, as an industry, we're very comfortable with making do. And you combine making do with buffers and the trash you just described, and you begin to understand that that's how we oftentimes work our way through a project. We make do, and as long as the budgets look good, we're good.
Yeah, I think that's at the heart of what happens. If you know, there's that great saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Which Colin Powell says is the aphorism of scallywags and scoundrels.
Right.
Because just because it ain't broke doesn't mean it's working well.
Yeah, and you know, one of the sayings that the founder of Facebook continuously gets thrown in his face is an email he sent out to all of his employees when they were an up and coming company, and that was break things and go fast.
Right.
So a couple of things that I'd sort of like to touch on that are my new sort of fascination, if you will. As you go through the Toyota Way book, the majority of that book is about the principles on which the Toyota Motor Company was founded. And there are references in there to lots of other things, but it is portrayed as the story or the Toyota Way. The Toyota Way field book is Likers and another guy, Meyer, working on the practical application of the Toyota production system into a new organization. And obviously all of that is still, I mean, it is fundamentally within a manufacturing framework, not exclusively, but most of the examples are manufacturing. And the thing that began to happen to me, particularly as we started to move from doing these potential zones to developing a production system, was a couple things I began to realize were missing from the conversation. One was culture, and culture is one of those things that we as an industry have a fairly strong allergy to. It is something that we like to think we're all tough guys and we can do stuff. And one of the things that Oglesby pointed out is that construction workers have feelings just like everybody else.
What a surprise.
And the other was learning. You know, the book, The Goal by Goldratt was, if you ask most people about Goldratt, they will say, oh yeah, The Goal. But Goldratt also wrote a book that is basically a textbook called The Theory of Constraints. Right. And it in there, rather than just telling stories, he's writing about what he's thinking, and the basis of his because the theory of constraints is incredibly cool. But there's a line in there that where he talks about resistance, and I'm not going to quote it exactly, but he said, the only power strong enough to overcome resistance to change is the energy of the discoverer. And as I read that, I remember sitting there thinking, golly, all of us, that is all of us who've been doing this for so long, are just vibrating with energy because of the discoveries we're making. And then we put it into a PowerPoint and present it to a bunch of construction foremen and are surprised that they're not as excited about it as we are.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely, you're so right. I mean, the cultural piece is so important because everybody has a culture, whether they recognize it or not.
That's right.
It's like systems thinking. Everything is a system, whether you recognize it or not. It's better if you recognize it because you might be able to do something about it. But culture has, I mean, every construction company is branded with their artifact, right? Their logo is their artifact. They have ways of speaking inside the company where everybody knows what that language is. And everybody knows, well, I hope you have a good weekend means I hope you're doing 18 hours, at the job. And they understand the language, that, language is important to culture, artifacts are important to culture, learning is especially important to culture. And they only teach what they believe they have learned and is necessary to pass on to people. So when we come in to teach things, we're teaching things that it's like teaching a culture that has grown up making canoes how to drive a bus. And it's just so distant to them
that's right.
The cultural piece is so important, and it has to catch on somewhere. And
it was the combination of those two things that made me begin to totally change my consulting, because prior to that, I would get in front of a group of people and show them the case study on from the Honolulu project, the Mackay Viaduct, where we'd gone from 54 man days to 17, and how we did it and how we understood it. And this is how we begin to track the process metrics, and this is how you can do that. And there would just be blank stares. And I could never understand why there was not excitement about it. And I think that's for two reasons. One, nobody likes to be told that there is opportunity where they think they're doing as best they can. Number two is one of the things I learned was it's always good to have your return airplane ticket in your shirt pocket because people realize you'll be leaving before long.
Yeah.
But so I began to change the way I worked with clients, and that was they have to learn how to apply these concepts that are just like the Shingo Institute principles. They've got to learn why those are important and how to apply them in their own organization and build that themselves. And along the way, discover how that works. And as they discover it, they grow the energy that overcomes the resistance within their organization. And that has been a huge breakthrough for me. Just it made me realize that it doesn't matter what I know. It has no bearing as long as I'm not structuring my engagement with them to help them discover what they don't know and be excited about what they just discovered. And I hope that makes sense, because it's.
Oh, no, it makes perfect sense. It is at the essence of the aha moment. It is when they say, oh, now I get it. Because before that, they're saying, well, 54 to 17 days. I mean, you were in Hawaii, and you had no weather delays, and you had access to people, and, there's no traffic there. And, boom, boom, boom. I can just make up a list, not even knowing that project, of what the naysayers would say. That's why, my favorite simulation, as they say in academia, is to make a card game, which is a takeoff on the airplane game. But it has so many rich experiences, and I can't tell you how excited foremen have gotten playing that game when they all of a sudden see that we're not trying to get them to do their work faster. We're trying to take away the space between the work. All of that stuff that happens between the time that you're asked to do a task and you can actually do it, the make ready part, the organization, how the system works, all of that stuff. And you can do that putting 5 dots on a little card in about an hour and a half. And all of a sudden people are going, wow, there's something to this.
Right. I've done the same kind of thing with a very simple Lego exercise where we do one where they discover how to put it together, and then we do another where they discover how to put it together and then spend 15 minutes planning how they're going to put it together, not what it takes, not how it has to be shaped, but how they're going to assemble it. And typically the differences between those are 7 to 8 minutes compared to about 6 seconds. And it is in those kinds of experiential things that people finally get an understanding of the difference between discovering as you build versus planning how to do it and assemble it to a detailed plan. So, but a couple things that happened along the way. I was working on the Olmstead Dam, which at the time was the largest navigation project that the Corps had undertaken, and it was a very unique job in that they were building the dam in the wet. That is, they were not going to put in coffer dams because they were afraid of erosion on the Kentucky side of the river into a wilderness area, and so they were precasting 4,500 ton pieces and then floating them out into the Ohio River and putting them down at the 30 feet below the surface on 1/4 inch XYZ kinds of requirements. And we were deploying a project production system there with them to help them. And the reason I wanted to get involved with that job was because of the repetition of the castings. And we knew that we could improve those over time. And I was flying home, and a friend of mine had given me Mike Rother's book, Toyota Kata. And I realized as I read that book that finally I had an understanding as to how we could deploy the production system. In fact, Rother, I had dinner with him one night, and I was working on a paper called How to Employ Toyota Kata into a Lean project production environment. And he brought the paper I'd been working on with him, and there was a bunch of pink highlights. And I said, I see a bunch of highlights. What are those? He said, you 27 times in your paper, you used the word implement. And he said, I would suggest that you do a search and replace and use deploy. Implement, he said, when you implement the next version of Windows, you put the disk in, you take the disk out, and now you've implemented Windows 7 or whatever. He said, what you're talking about is a journey that you only start by deploying, and you continue to deploy, and you're just going all along. So back to the idea that we have to have learning, and we have to have the people learn it themselves, but that they can't feel like they're drinking from a fire hose. We had come up with requirements for all of the aspects of the production system we'd worked on: how to hold daily end of shift meetings, weekly team production planning meetings, how to populate the boards, how to put the Post-it notes together, what the requirements were for the Post-it notes. And I realized we could begin to incrementally deploy that by having teams strive to achieve 2 or 3 of those requirements first, and then using kata, setting full use of the requirements as the challenge, and then target conditions of 2 or 3. And that was a huge breakthrough for us, because now we knew that we could begin to deploy this in a very structured and intentional way, using Rother's work with an improvement routine. And we use that to this day. A thing that I'd like to sort of explore is some ideas that I've had, and as when I started consulting, one of the things I realized that I didn't know anything at all about was industrial engineering. So I joined the American Society of Industrial Engineers, thinking that to my surprise, I could join it without having ever taken a first class in industrial engineering.
Fantastic.
And I eventually submitted a paper. I think you've heard the story of the Chocolate Bayou project, where we discovered that the craftsmen were actually right, that 50% of the time they were getting turned down when they went to the tool room. And so I wrote a paper on that and submitted it. And to my surprise, I was sitting on a group of guys making presentations at a American Association of Industrial Engineers convention. And to my right was the head of industrial engineering at Ford, and to my left was the industrial engineer from DuPont. And I'm this young consultant that has not taken a single course in industrial engineering. And afterwards, the guy asked me, the GM guy said, I was fascinated by that. I kept thinking to myself, how do we get that into our software system to get those kinds of numbers? He said, how did you do that? And I said, we sat in the tool room and marked yes or no, and then totaled up the answers.
High tech, another high tech response.
Right. But the point I want to make is, my guess, and I think you mentioned that you were hoping to either have done or to do a session with Jeff Leiker. But I would be willing to bet that Jeff Leiker will tell you that either the Toyota Way or the Toyota Way Field Book is by far the biggest selling book he's done. And yet he's done 3 or 4 other books: Toyota, how Toyota's going to grow people, how they solve problems, how they improve, lots and lots of other books. And in addition to that, there is the work that Mike Rother did that discovered, sort of defined how they manage and how they create continuous improvement. The Shingo Institute has lots of books and workshops now on the principles that Shigeo Shingo sort of introduced to the Toyota system, and has since obviously is now passed, but really expanded on them. The training within industry is something that was taken to Japan after the war, that got built into the Toyota culture, or into the Toyota production system. And the thing that I found frustrating about 3 or 4 years ago, Dick, was that you can go to a conference on kata. Mike Rother started a thing called KataCon, where every year all the kata geeks get together and they all talk kata. Typically at the same time or the same week, there is a conference on how to use TWI. And then you can attend the Shingo Institute has lots of people who will deliver workshops around the Shingo principles and systems design and so on. So I started talking with this client that I've been working with for many, many years in Iowa. And I said, we need to figure out, when you read the Toyota Way, you read about the Toyota Way. You don't have to read a book by Shingo. You don't have to read a book by Mike Rother. It is incorporated into the Toyota Way. And my sense is we will never get the full benefit of the tools that are part of the Lean Construction Institute toolbox, and the ones that I've helped develop, particularly around production operation engineering, until we develop the means with which to weave together a fabric, a cultural fabric that incorporates not only methods and methodologies of doing the work, but all of those other things that were built into the Toyota culture as they developed the Toyota production system. I hope that all of that makes some sense.
Oh yeah, no, it makes perfect sense, because the thought about incorporating what the Toyota production system does and what the Toyota Way was the subject of their second book, Lean Thinking, right? Warnock and Jones.
Right.
Where they said, well, is this transportable to the US or to Germany or to other cultures? Is this exclusively Japanese because of the culture that they have developed, lifetime employment, respect for, hierarchy and chains and all the rest of that stuff. And so, I mean, I recommend that book to everybody as well, because it's a remarkable understanding of how these things are timeless and culture free, that the ideas around these things are so powerful that if you just start thinking that way, you'll just never go back. Like the shrink wrap guy, right? It took him 2 months to make a shrink wrap machine, and then suddenly he was making 4 shrink wrap machines a week. It's very much like your experience at 54 days down to 17 days. But until you experience that stuff, your eyes are heavy with what we carry around in our traditions and our legacies, and what we think our experiential baggage really is. Everybody recreates experiences in different ways. Have ask somebody to tell it's like the telephone game, right? Tell the same story, have 5 people tell the same story, and it usually has several different outcomes.
Right.
So it is absolutely crucial, as you say.
And the concept of, I mentioned the idea of quality and requirements that came from Phil Crosby's book, Quality is Free. And I'd read that early on as I started consulting. And so we used the word requirements for a long time. Since then, and having gotten much more understanding in terms of Toyota, or the training within industry and the concept of standardized work, we're now using, we realized all along we were trying to achieve standardized work. We were just calling it requirements because that was the language that I learned reading Crosby's book.
Right.
So now one of the companies that I talked to you about that I'd like to share just a bit and encourage you to get in touch with those guys and really let them tell their story, because they're the ones that are excited about what they're discovering. But This is a company that 5 years ago decided that they were much more likely to make project completion dates and budgets if they were extremely collaborative and very low tech, as opposed to very high tech and low collaboration. So one of the first things they did was decide they were no longer going to use computerized CPM scheduling. And there's now been times when a client will say, well, you have to provide us a CPM schedule. And they'd say, well, let me tell you 3 or 4 contractors that we know will do that.
Yeah.
If you're interested in having your project delivered on time and on schedule and on budget, and they are in the process of finishing up 2 each $150 million schools started during COVID, and there's kids in the classroom now, right on schedule, right on budget. In fact, they're ahead of they're below budget on one of the jobs. So they decided we're going to have the entire project schedule portrayed in post-it notes on what they call the CP 2.0 trailer, CP 2.0 being construction production 2.0. And every project now is equipped with exactly the same trailer. It's a 12 by 40 foot trailer that has boards on it. The entire project schedule from beginning to end is portrayed on the boards on the far right side, and then post-it notes move to the left, and they go through a should filter. They go through a make certain task list. Then they go through a 2-week preparation time, and then a can filter, and so on. Every project now uses those boards exclusively. No project uses a CPM schedule, and they are killing it. Additionally, they are standardizing all of their meetings, all of their requirements, and so on. One of the things we're learning is that the single most important planning event is that one that bridges between a project schedule. And I'm convinced this is the case, whether it's a computerized project schedule or the phased pull production schedule that these guys are using, and the short-term look-ahead production schedule. One of the things that at American Infrastructure, Dick, that we began to realize was I'm convinced one of the most important changes in production thinking that engineer Ono injected into the Toyota production system was the concept of continuous single piece flow.
Right.
And as we begin to talk about that and think about it, and I would call Greg and Glenn and say, we don't pass pieces. How do we do that? Well, one night over some very good wine, a couple of the guys I was working with at American Infrastructure, it suddenly dawned on us that what we do pass is the production output of one crew day.
Right.
And so we came up with a concept of daily crew production flow, meaning that it's critical that we express the work in individual daily crew production targets and the specific production output. And so the translation from very large chunks of work with very little detail to individual daily work assignments, to bridge that, that typically, like in Rother's language and Leiker's language, they talk about value streams. We talk about crew parade production planning, because as Greg pointed out, we build work with a parade of crews. And that crew parade production planning is now where we're spending amazing amount of effort trying to figure out how to do that, and to do that well, because that is the percent plan complete on the far left end of the boards will be a direct reflection of how well a group of guys that or foremen that are involved with a parade of crews that are required to get a milestone or a major chunk of work done, work together as a team and hold each other accountable for getting that work done. And that is not easy.
Right. It's funny because people have asked me for years, what's the technology that you would recommend for doing, pole planting and stickies on the wall? And I would say it's the one that people discovered a long time ago called a sticky, because there's nothing more powerful than the physical act of a trade foreman making a commitment about what work is going to be done and when it will be done in his own handwriting or her own handwriting, walking up to the board and making a public declaration, a political declaration in some senses, that this is my commitment to you that are sitting in the hall here.
That's right.
And,
That's
and
right.
you just can't do that on a computer.
That's right. That's exactly right. There's a great YouTube video out that a guy, and he's done lots of really good videos, but this one is about tell me how you make toast.
Oh yeah, I love that
one. And he uses a phrase in there that I think is really cool, and that is collaborative visualization.
Yeah. And there's also the Kaizen toast YouTube video as well, where the guy's sitting in the kitchen with his wife in the dining room, and he's trying to figure out how to get the toast there more efficiently, right?
So the other challenge is, how do we begin to get the concept of process metrics, that is, where we're seeing our work in terms of how work moves through space and time, as opposed to watching our work or looking at our work or wandering through our work, and get that resident at the crew level. And that has proven to be an amazingly powerful thing if you have project leaders that can get foremen comfortable understanding that if we discover what's really going on, it's not an indictment of them. It is a wonderful thing, because we know they can solve those things that are affecting them if we give them the opportunity to understand it, and that they have the ability to do that.
Right.
I mean, and so
I always represent that as great projects are built by crews who have the ability to flow through their work as if there were no other crews around.
That's right.
And only the crews can build that kind of connection between handoffs and space management and geography and real estate. It has to be the crews. It's very difficult. We've been trying to see if we can use models, 3D models, to anticipate how crews could move around. It's almost like parametric modeling of how crews move through projects. And we've taken a shot at trying to do that. And we usually, it fails completely unless the trades are involved in that. But that it begins to free up their mind that they don't need the entire space all the time, that there's 3 sides to this building, and there could be 3 different crews in every different hallway as they move through this thing, and just sowing the seed of what's possible then enables people to visualize it. I think the creative visualization that you talked about with, and that YouTube video on toast it's amazing what people think of as toast.
That's right. That's
right.
Think
that'd be pretty easy.
That's right. That's right. So the sort of the wonderful thing is, the journey has been a 4 million mile jet ride that has just been unbelievably exciting and fun. And my wife asks me why I keep accumulating air miles, and I tell her that when I die, the only way I'm going to have anybody at the place is if I got enough air miles to get them there, because I know very few people in the town where I live.
Right. But I know that feeling. Yeah.
But I think the frontiers for us now, I mean, from my perspective, and I have intentionally been flying way below the radar. I was not interested in, Glenn said, well, why didn't you write a paper on the 125 potential zones? I said, Glenn, because we were going so fast, nobody was interested in writing a paper. We were interested in trying to figure out how to take what we learned and apply it to something else. And so I have been intentionally, in fact, when those guys decided we were actually all 3 of us were on a flight out of Maracaibo on our way home from Venezuela from the last trip that we were down there. And I got upgraded and the two of them didn't. And they were sitting opposite each other in an exit row. And they began to come up with the idea of LCI. And we had lunch in Miami when we got there. And they were fairly excited about it. And I said, well, you guys, because they were talking about very big companies. I said, you guys, I totally encourage you to do that. I personally am going to start working with smaller individual companies because I've grown very very unexcited about the opportunity or the possibilities of ever getting somebody in the top 10 of the ENR to fully adopt this in a way that it will make a difference. And I've become disenchanted with associations, construction associations, because they seem to just simply feed back what their members tell them they want. And so I'm going to just work with smaller companies. And as a result, a lot of the learning that has taken place, unfortunately, did not get documented, did not get put into some sort of formal papers. But boy, the learning has been rich. And the thrill of working with the clients I have now is just, I wish I had another 40 years to do this.
Well, so this podcast has been part of trying to distribute what you have learned over those years. So I really appreciate you taking the time. I think of you, Mike, as Adam Smith's invisible hand. You're the one that's back there guiding us toward where our best interests actually are, because you've done so much work. You've been so influential on the people who have been influential in our business. You've been, Glenn and Greg and have always spoken about, well, Mike Casten is the guy that came up with this idea. And Greg described the day that he met you as one of the luckiest days in his life. And then Dana would look at him and go, well, really? So it's been great to share with you. I really appreciate you taking the time. The stories have been great. The dog was fantastic. The wine delivery interruption was perfect. All of the things that we think about. Thanks for being a champion for the things that I have come to learn and know. And thanks for taking the time to share that with us today.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I will share a couple of things with you just to wrap up. We were getting near the end of our engagement on the second Venezuelan project, and we were having dinner in Caracas, and the three of us. And Glenn said something about, all three of us have a different perspective. And I said, explain that, Glenn. He said, well, my goal is to make construction logical. I was a philosophy major. I just want to make it logical to where it makes sense. And we got a lot of work to do before it's logical. Greg, on the other hand, wants to understand what the concepts are, what the fundamental concepts are that we have to understand in order to make it work. And you just want to make it fun.
Which is true. And those guys have made it fun, but not as fun as you have.
So if you would like, Dick, I will forward you the. By the way, the other guy at University of Texas was Richard Tucker.
Oh, there you
go. If you would like, I will forward you some contact information for these two guys at Story. I think if nothing else, if you had a chat with them, you would find them fascinating, and they will be able to tell their story in a very different way, because they are learning everything they know right there on site. And they're doing it on their own.
Well, that's what we love. So sure, I would really appreciate that. I'd love to make contact with them. My journey is always just to find where these things are happening and what motivates people and how they actually get going,
right,
towards their goals. And I think my deep philosophy is that work empowers people, and really good work really empowers people to be better, to have a much
That's
better
right.
understanding of how the world works. There's a book, I can't remember the exact title, but it's something about making stuff, basically, how powerful it is to take your hands and make stuff with. And your early job as a helping your dad on the farm, my early job as a sheet metal apprentice. I mean, these things are not, these are experiences that never leave you, about
That's
how
right.
important it is not to just talk about it, but to actually make stuff
That's right.
and make
That's
the
right.
world better. And
That's right.
I think we are, I think we have perceptively changed the way that buildings are built in the world to some degree. We have people thinking about it. And I appreciate your pioneership in that. You've been out there, scrapping in the lands, having a ton of fun, though, I suspect.
Yes. Yes, for sure. For sure.
Well, Mike, thanks so
Good.
much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And we'll chat later, I hope.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for the opportunity and for all you do with the way, because you are one of the several mouthpieces that allow these messages to get out, and that's really important.
Well, I appreciate that. And thanks for joining the mouthpiece.
Okay. Have a great day.
Have a great day. Thanks,
Okay.
buddy.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Lean Construction Blogs podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please help us spread the word by sharing, subscribing, or leaving a review on your preferred podcast listening platform. Remember to join us next time as we continue to lower the barriers to applying lean construction and help take your lean journey to the next level. And don't forget to visit the Lean Construction blog to stay up to date on our latest podcast episodes, weekly blog posts, monthly webinars, and upcoming conferences. We hope to see you on the next episode.